At first glance, the borders of the Middle East seem like any other, lines on a map shaped by geography, culture, maybe even language. But that's not what happened. The modern Middle East was created in the aftermath of a war that destroyed empires, and in their place, it left behind a set of fragile, unnatural boundaries, drawn by people who had never set foot in the region. What followed was a century of instability, war, and fractured identities, all rooted in decisions made behind closed doors. This is the story of how the modern Middle East was carved from betrayal, deception, and colonial ambition. When the war broke out in 1914, Europe became a battlefield. But the tremors shook the entire world. On one side were the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia. On the other stood the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. What started as a regional conflict over a political assassination quickly metastasized into the first truly global war, thanks to colonial empires that stretched across continents. For the Ottoman Empire, once a sprawling Islamic caliphate that controlled large swaths of the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe, the war came at a precarious time. Long nicknamed the Sick Man of Europe, the empire was bleeding internally. Nationalist movements were rising among Arabs, Armenians, and Kurds. Infrastructure was decaying. The military was outdated. The economy was in shambles. But strategically, the Ottomans still held massive territory, especially in the Arab world, and their alliance with Germany made them a threat the Allies couldn't ignore. But more than just territory was at stake. The British and French had their eyes on resources, namely oil, which had become essential for fueling modern warfare. Control of the Middle East meant control of energy. Add to that the region's crucial trade routes, like the Suez Canal, and the stakes became even higher. When the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, the war expanded to include the Middle East. The British began considering how to undermine Ottoman control from within, and how to carve up the region afterward. But from the start, imperial interest was wrapped in moral language. Promises of freedom and self-rule were made not as ends in themselves, but as bargaining chips. Meanwhile, Arab nationalists had their own vision. Many hoped the war would be their chance to finally break free of imperial rule, Ottoman or otherwise, and establish a sovereign Arab state. But they were stepping into a game that was rigged before it began. World War I didn't just destroy old empires, it created a vacuum, and the powers who filled it did so with treaties, betrayals, and borders that would ripple through the next century. Enter the Arabs. Many Arab leaders, particularly Sharif Hussein of Mecca, had long chafed under Ottoman rule. The British saw an opportunity. In a series of secret letters between 1915 and 1916, known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, the British promised Hussein an independent Arab kingdom if he led a revolt against the Ottomans. Arab fighters, including the now iconic Lawrence of Arabia, joined the effort. They blew up trains, attacked supply lines, and fought a guerrilla war alongside British forces, all the while believing that after the war they would rule themselves. But there was a problem. Even as Britain promised the Arabs independence, it was cutting a very different deal. In 1916, the British and French drew up a secret agreement, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was named after the two diplomats who drafted it, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France. This agreement carved up the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. France would control modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take modern-day Iraq, Jordan, and a strong influence over Palestine. The Arabs would get nothing. This agreement wasn't public at the time. The Arab leaders fighting for their freedom had no idea that, behind their backs, European powers were already dividing the spoils. And then came a leak. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they exposed the agreement to the world. Arab leaders were furious. As if double-dealing the Arabs wasn't enough, Britain made yet another promise during the war. In 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter expressing British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This was the Balfour Declaration. It was one sentence, but it changed everything. The letter was addressed to Lord Rothschild, a leader in the British Jewish community, and it was meant to gain support from Zionist Jews in Britain and America for the war effort. But here's the catch. Britain had now promised the same land to two different groups. To the Arabs, they had promised independence across the Middle East, including Palestine. To the Jews, they promised a national home in that very same land. This contradiction would set the stage for over a century of conflict. The war ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the victors began to reshape the region. Rather than granting independence, the League of Nations established mandates, a polite term for colonies. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. These mandates were presented as a form of stewardship. In practice, they were outright imperial control. Arab revolts broke out in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. The British and French crushed them. This wasn't just a betrayal of promises, it was the institutionalization of a lie. The people of the region were told they weren't ready to rule themselves, that they needed guidance, civilization. What many received instead were broken promises, foreign-backed regimes, and decades of unrest. The image of Western nations as liberators began to unravel. What had started as political resentment grew into something deeper: generational disillusionment. One of the most enduring legacies of this era was the drawing of modern borders. These borders often had no relation to ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground. They split communities and forced others together. Iraq, for instance, lumped together Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds under a single British-backed monarchy. Syria was split into multiple sectarian states before being jammed back together. Lebanon was carved out specifically to give Maronite Christians a majority. These were not borders created for stability, they were borders created for convenience, for control. And they created pressure cookers that would explode again and again throughout the 20th century. The consequences of these lies are still playing out to this day. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is perhaps the most visible and enduring legacy of Britain's conflicting promises. The 1917 Balfour Declaration supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a region where the vast majority of the population was Arab. At the same time, Britain had already promised Arab leaders that they would support Arab independence, including in Palestine, if they revolted against the Ottomans. These contradictory pledges created deep confusion and resentment. When the British Mandate took over after World War I, the influx of Jewish immigrants, many fleeing anti-Semitic violence in Europe, accelerated. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities escalated into violence. Arab uprisings were met with brutal crackdowns. British authorities found themselves caught in a trap of their own making, unable to appease either side. This unresolved conflict would eventually explode into civil war, the creation of Israel in 1948, and the ongoing struggle that continues to dominate Middle Eastern politics today. Before European intervention, identities in the Ottoman Middle East were often defined more by religion, tribe, or locality than by national borders. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement and later mandates carved the region into artificial states with little regard for ethnic or sectarian realities. Iraq, for example, was stitched together from three very different Ottoman provinces: a Sunni center, a Shiite south, and a Kurdish north. Syria, too, was a patchwork of religious and ethnic groups, from Alawites and Druze to Christians and Sunni Arabs. Colonial powers didn't just draw the borders, they also picked favorites. In Iraq, the British installed a Sunni monarchy over a Shiite majority, sowing deep divisions. In Syria, the French empowered minority groups like the Alawites to help control the majority, which only intensified resentment and distrust. These decisions laid the groundwork for future coups, civil wars, and sectarian violence. The power struggles in modern Iraq and Syria are not just modern issues. They are echoes of borders that never fit the people forced to live inside them. The Kurds, an ethnic group numbering over 30 million, were promised independence after World War I. The 1920 Treaty of Sèvres included provisions for a possible Kurdish state, but that promise was abandoned just 3 years later in the Treaty of Lausanne, which made no mention of Kurdish autonomy. As a result, the Kurds were divided across 4 newly formed states: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. In each of these countries, they were treated with suspicion, often denied cultural rights, and in some cases brutally repressed. In Iraq, for instance, the Kurds faced repeated chemical attacks under Saddam Hussein. In Turkey, Kurdish identity was for decades denied outright, and the use of the Kurdish language was banned in public spaces. To this day, the Kurds remain one of the largest stateless nations in the world, a direct consequence of the way the post-Ottoman world was divided. The Middle East was not just shaped by foreign powers, it was scarred by them. For many Arabs, the post-war period came to symbolize betrayal on a grand scale. They had shed blood in the hope of independence, only to see their lands turned into mandates, their leaders sidelined, and their futures dictated from abroad. The resentment that took root wasn't simply about territory, it was about broken promises and the humiliation of being treated as pawns in a larger imperial game. That sentiment did not disappear with the end of colonial rule. It mutated, deepened, and passed from one generation to the next. What began as anti-imperial frustration has fueled everything from pan-Arab nationalism to extremist ideologies. From the Suez Crisis to the rise of militant groups, many of the region's most volatile flashpoints are tethered to a shared memory of deception and domination. These aren't just historical footnotes, they are the structural foundations of modern geopolitics in the Middle East. When people ask why there is so much instability in the region, the answer is often made to seem simple: tribalism, extremism, oil. But the deeper truth is far older. It's written in old telegrams, secret maps, and imperial deals. We already explored the promises Britain made to the Arabs during the war, promises of independence in return for their rebellion against the Ottomans. But to fully understand just how foundational that betrayal was, we need to revisit the Arab Revolt. Not just as a wartime event, but as the point where the illusion of liberation began to shatter. Sharif Hussein, leader of the Arab Revolt, received little in return for his alliance with the British. His sons were installed as monarchs, Faisal in Iraq, Abdullah in Jordan, but these were British-controlled mandates, not independent kingdoms. Hussein himself was eventually exiled. The Hashemite dynasty still rules in Jordan, but the broader vision of a united Arab state never materialized. It died at the Paris Peace Conference, where Arab voices were sidelined in favor of European interests. The betrayal of the Arab Revolt became more than just a broken promise. It became a symbol. A moment that crystallized the fear that liberation movements in the region would be used, then discarded. That legacy didn't fade. It echoed through revolts, nationalist movements, propaganda, and textbooks, each telling a different version of who was betrayed and by whom. Today, the map of the Middle East looks clean, with straight lines and sharp corners. But those lines bleed. They run through ancient cities, across tribal lands, over holy sites. And when war breaks out, whether in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, or Gaza, it's not just about religion or politics. It's about who drew the line and who has to live with it. It's about who made the deal and who paid the price. The modern Middle East wasn't born. It was engineered, not by the people who lived there, but by men who never set foot in the deserts or mountains or coastal cities they divided. They lied. They made promises they never intended to keep. And with every broken promise, every artificial border, they set fires that still haven't gone out. If we want to understand the Middle East today, we can't just look at the headlines. We have to look at the maps, the letters, the lies. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in history is a pen.